So recently I was looking into topics for other videos and I came across this poster competition by Bendy the Ink Machine. The goal of this poster competition was to have people make some sort of themed fan art with the goal of getting it put into the game. And while there were some issues and controversies with that competition that I won't talk about, the thing that stuck out to me was that it was incredibly similar to the new Poppy Playtime competition going on, where people have to make some sort of themed fan art and the winners end up getting put into the game as well. This could be brushed off as a mere coincidence. But what's weird is that these two games in comparison in almost every other way have a noticeable amount of similarities. Some to the point where you could even question if Poppy Playtime themselves might have taken a lot of inspiration, maybe even too much. I mean, we've seen people compare the viral game to Ecker Coaster's Venge, but I feel like the real game that's worth questioning here would be the immensely popular Bendy the Ink Machine, and unfortunately, I'd say there's more similarities than I'd like to admit. So right out of the gate, one of the biggest similarities I first started to notice about this game was that the stories between these two were incredibly similar. To give you a quick breakdown, Bendy the Ink Machine in the most basic way possible is all about visiting an abandoned animation factory that the player used to work at. Upon entering, what seems weird about this factory is that there's no more co-workers around, and instead there's a bunch of tapes documenting the story of the studio, giving us clues as to where the other animators may have gone. To our surprise, through the exploration of the factory, we end up encountering real-life versions of the characters we once created. What's so interesting about these characters is that they all resemble connections to the lost co-workers as shown in the many tapes around the map. The infamous ink machine in question was the one that ended up being responsible for this, because the secret behind it is supposedly that it's a device that can recreate animated figures into real-life beings with the goal of bringing the cartoons to life. But throughout the ink machine's creation, it started to be done using real-life souls. The first experiment on this ink machine was going to result in the creation of Bendy himself, of course, but things had gone wrong, leading to him being corrupted and evil in the end. That's the most basic way I can describe the origins of the Bendy game, but in terms of Poppy, this is where we start to see some of the weird similarities. Just note that some of these things are based on theories because the game isn't entirely out yet. So Poppy Playtime's story is about a character who used to work at a toy factory, and after many years the co-workers had disappeared, leaving a note for the employee to visit the factory and figure out what happened to the missing people. When moving through the game solving puzzles, we find tapes laying around that are used to show the origins of the factory and what may have happened to the missing co-workers. What is shown in this game as the main antagonists are the toys of the factory that have seemingly come to life trying to murder the players. Moving into more theoretical parts of the story, based on the tapes, there have been these experiments going on behind the scenes, and the most highly supported theories about these experiments point to them being the recreation of the toys as real-life figures. And while we can't 100% prove this is the case, there's tons of clues throughout the tapes that point to this, and it almost feels intentional that a selling point of the Poppy Playtime doll is that she is, quote, like a real girl, which could potentially show the company's passion towards making super realistic figures. Some have gone as far as to say that Poppy herself could have been a successful version of these experiments, hence why she isn't hostile, while toys like Huggy turned out to be failures and they turned evil and attacked. That's all that we really know about the Poppy Playtime story, but I hope just reading these showed the obvious similarities, but let's break them down. They both are about searching abandoned factories. They both are being explored with the goal of finding where the other co-workers have gone after being suspiciously invited back to the residence. Both antagonists of the games are based around once fictional characters coming to life to haunt the player, and according to theories, they may also both be based on failed experiments of characters that led to them becoming monstrous. So the next thing that I noticed about these two games is that their gameplay is also pretty similar, at least conceptually. To Poppy Playtime's credit, it does feel like they're taking new approaches, at least to some things, but it's still shares a lot with Bendy, and according to theories, they may also both be based on failed experiments of characters that led to them becoming monstrous. So the next thing that I noticed about these two games is that their gameplay is also pretty similar, at least conceptually. To Poppy Playtime's credit, it does feel like they're taking new approaches, at least to some things, but it still shares a lot with Bendy to the point where it's worth mentioning. Bendy's gameplay is pretty simple. You're in a first-person environment searching for clues and solving puzzles. You spend pretty much the entirety of the game solving these puzzles, with the game mostly being a passive experience, but eventually these gameplay elements are interrupted by a couple scares or monsters, but generally throughout the chapters there will be a moment or two where you actually come face to face with the antagonists themselves, interrupting the puzzles in favor of running for your own survival. In Poppy's case, once again, you also spend time solving puzzles, with most of the game revolving around these puzzles and only being interrupted by small teases as to what may come, and similarly the game ends with one big climax where we actually come face to face with the monster themselves. This aspect is probably one of the less incriminating similarities between the two, just because it's not like any one game can be a puzzle horror game, but when considering the previous and yet to be mentioned factors that make this game feel so similar to Bendy, it's pretty clear the gameplay elements were inspired. Okay, so these games' demographics are just the exact same. They target younger audiences who like horror, simple enough. But what makes it interesting is that they aren't just being directed at any children, but more specifically children who enjoy YouTube. Ever since games like FNAF came around, it became increasingly popular to try and make your game viral by 1, aiming for a younger, more impressionable audience, and 2, getting indirect endorsements from the biggest YouTubers around. Getting people like Markiplier to play FNAF was debatedly why it snowballed all the way into what it was today. And similarly, Bendy seemed to piggyback off that idea by getting its fame from YouTubers and communities trying out the game. Now, Poppy, sort of for better or for worse, seemed to almost entirely design their game around this aspect, making open-ended conclusions filled with lore, jump scares, puzzles, basically trying to formulaically develop a game designed just to go viral. Hell, the people who made the game were already established YouTubers, so they already had a head start to this weird YouTube growth thing, and it clearly worked. I mean, the Chapter 2 trailer alone has raked in over 45 million views, doubling the trailer for even the newest Call of Duty game with just a single chapter. So while you can debate whether Poppy making their game like this was a good or bad move, I feel like it's pretty damn clear that this game was designed to replicate the successes of Bendy among other indie horror games. So there's a few other smaller things that I couldn't really categorize that also show how similar these games are. Bendy is a game that released in chapters every few months to build hype, and Poppy is doing the same thing right now. Both games are designed with recognizable and, dare I say, easily merchandisable characters. They both are designed and developed in a retro manner, portraying horror themes through low-quality television and atmosphere. And well, they both are incredibly controversial. So this isn't directly related to the overall game, but my goodness are these games both controversial. First, we have the Bendy controversy. The only real controversy throughout the development was the questionable on-the-spot ending of the full game, along with the many bugs that ran alongside its release. But it wouldn't be until a bit after the game had released that Bendy would get into some real serious trouble. In October of 2019, it would be announced that 50 members of the Bendy team were suddenly let off for seemingly no reason. This was a pretty shady move by the team. Firstly, because there was said to be no notice upon these employees being fired, but what was interesting was what did the actual workers think of this? Well, fortunately enough, thanks to job review websites, we would get some primary insight as to what the average day of the job would be like, and it wasn't pretty. We heard about alleged lack of job security, unprofessional handling of job situations, and just overall unsatisfactory working conditions. But why would the team even do this? Well, it's still theoretical, kind of. There is a theory that's pretty concrete, and the theory suggests the reason for it was because of the next big Bendy type game called Showdown Bandit. I won't get into the gameplay of this title because it's entirely separate from Bendy, but it was made by the same developers and they were banking on this game's success. There were tons of promotions along with pre-made merchandise with the naive hope of this being the next Bendy, but the game would actually end up flopping, and therefore the team was out of a lot of money. So consequently, people think they would very abruptly fire a huge amount of their staff team to save money. This was a pretty big deal a couple years ago, but it still wouldn't be the end of Bendy controversy, because just a couple months ago, the Bendy merch store would actually go down. Initially, many people, including myself, were thinking that this was when we were finally going to get the infamous Bendy sequel that has been teased for literally years now. And the reason for that is because when the site went down, we were given a new screenshot of the game and tons of hope. The only problem is it would very quickly come out that the reason for the store going down had nothing to do with the new game, but rather because in December of 2021, Bendy, more specifically Joey Drew Studios, was actually being sued by Fat Mojo for nearly $500 million. The reason for this? Well, honestly, we don't really know because it's just too soon, and the Bendy team doesn't like to talk about controversy, so I wouldn't expect to ever really know for sure. But the theory is that it had something to do with the massive amounts of merchandising Fat Mojo was set to produce for Joey Drew Studio games. More specifically, this already mentioned Showdown Bandit game that we already know in the end flopped horribly, leading to a significant loss in profits for the company. I can't confirm this or even confirm the guilt of the studio just because we don't know that much, but regardless, this is such a massive issue that could even result in the Bendy team losing it all. I mean, this isn't a small, even multi-million-dollar lawsuit, this is $500 million on the line here. But moving on to Poppy Playtime, the controversies here are just as plentiful. I mean, the literal reason I'm making this video is because their first major controversy is that this game is incredibly similar to others. It's very formulaic formulaic and seems to take almost too much inspiration from other successful horror games. Moving from that, there's also been a lot of problems surrounding the developers and their past. Generally, I don't like to hold an entire company accountable for alleged problems from just a couple people, but it's definitely worth noting that Enchanted Mob, one of the game's initial creators, had a ton of controversy leading up to this point, also dealing with alleged theft and manipulation. But focusing back onto the original game, by far the biggest controversy has been the merchandising problems. Poppy Playtime is performing pretty well, but that has led to quite a lot of methods by the developers to try and profit off of it. There's been some minor issues around the fact that they've been making you pay for every single chapter, and the fact that you're forced to buy every single previous chapter in order to buy the newer ones, but that's pretty standard. The real issue comes in when discussing the external merchandising of things like shirts and other marketable items. This team has had just one chapter to go off of and has already had multiple merch drops, a plush drop, a poster drop, and there's plans in May to make figures of the characters, along with new chapter 2 merch, and of course most infamously the team had started to market their own NFTs, which is definitely crossing the line in my opinion. I've tried to give the developers the benefit of the doubt in previous videos talking about the NFTs, but I really feel like we're reaching the point where it's starting to become clear that these, along with pretty much every other merch drop, was there just to make more money, especially when you start to consider that the point of the NFTs was to sell lore for $15, which isn't inherently terrible until you consider that you need to buy 6 separate NFTs in order to get it. Now, the Poppy team has made multiple statements against these NFTs, and they've already seemed to own up to their mistakes and announced they weren't going to be doing any more, but with all of the other different ways they've been trying to make money along with these NFTs, it starts to make me wonder if they're only apologizing because they got caught versus them actually being remorseful for sort of blatantly trying to get money out of people. So what's in common between Poppy and Bendy in these regards? Well, obviously they both have had their fair share of mistakes, but along with that, especially in Poppy's case, these could be major signs of lack of care for their own game. Firing 50 employees, minting 30,000 NFTs to try and profit off their impressionable audience. Things feel weirdly connected between these two among many other indie horror games. So it honestly feels like another big similarity between these two, even outside of the gameplay, could be the potential dark intentions of the developers. And what in the end led to Bendy becoming a controversial figure could in the future be followed by Poppy themselves doing the exact same thing, if not already. I enjoy both of these games. I still like to talk about these games. I mean, obviously if Poppy is so similar to Bendy and I liked Bendy, I would at least remotely enjoy it. But it seems clear to me that Poppy Playtime takes massive amounts of inspiration from tons of indie games, more specifically Bendy itself, which doesn't have to be a bad thing, but it honestly feels like Poppy keeps giving out more and more red flags over time, to the point where I'm already worried about the future of the title and we're only one chapter in. But hey, there's a new chapter coming out soon that seems promising despite these issues that I've had. Could this chapter differentiate the title and solidify Poppy Playtime among some of the great indie games? Or could it have it fall as nothing more than a cheap copy? Well, I guess in a few days we'll just have to find out.